Ngozi, if I don't tell you tonight, I will never find the courage again. You will spend the rest of your life sleeping beside a man who let another man die for
Say
him.
it. Whatever it is, say it plainly. Don't make me guess.
Chibuike did not sleep. Kelechi was there that night, and he has never told you the truth about what happened at that river.
On my wedding night, while my husband slept beside me, his best friend knocked on our door at midnight, pulled me outside, and whispered 11 words that destroyed everything I thought I knew about the man I had just married. 11 words, that's all it took. Stay with me till the end of this story, because what he told me was only the beginning. The real truth was buried far deeper, and by the time I found it, I understood that everyone in that compound had been lying to me since the day I arrived. If you love stories that twist and turn and refuse to let you guess the ending, subscribe now, because this one will not go the way you expect. My name is Ngozi. I was 26 years old the year I married Kelechi Obi, the only son of the wealthiest family in our town. Everybody said I was lucky. Everybody said God had finally smiled on me after everything I had lost. They did not know that luck in that compound always came with a price nobody told you about until it was too late to walk away. Let me take you back 2 years before that wedding night, because you need to understand what I lost before you understand what I found. Before Kelechi, there was another man. His name was Chibuike. We grew up on the same street, played under the same mango tree, and by the time we were 22, everyone in our town already called us husband and wife, even though no bride price had been paid yet. Chibuike was gentle in a way most men were not taught to be. He remembered small things, the way I liked my rice, the songs my late mother used to hum. He was saving money to build our house with his own hands, brick by brick, because he did not want to inherit anything. He wanted to earn it. 3 weeks before our own introduction ceremony, Chibuike went missing. They found his body 2 days later, floating at the bend of the river behind the old palm plantation. The elders called it an accident. They said he must have gone there at night to fetch water for a ritual bath before the wedding, slipped on the wet rocks and drowned. Nobody questioned it too hard. In our town, when a poor man dies, the case closes quickly. There is no family with enough money to demand a second look. I did not eat for 11 days after that. I remember my auntie forcing pap down my throat, holding my jaw open like I was a child. I remember thinking that grief was not sadness. Grief was a hand closing slowly around your throat, and no matter how much air you tried to pull in, it was never enough. It was Kelechi who pulled me out of that darkness. He was Chibuike's closest friend, closer than a brother, people said. They had grown up together, gone to the same primary school, and shared the same bowl of gari when neither family had money. After Chibuike died, Kelechi came to our house almost every single day. He never once tried to court me in those early months. He simply sat with me. He brought me oranges. He talked about Chibuike when everyone else had grown tired of the subject, when everyone else wanted me to move on and stop dwelling. Kelechi let me dwell. He let me cry. And slowly, without either of us naming it, something shifted between grief and gratitude slowly became something warmer. By the time Kelechi asked my father for my hand, 1.5 years had passed. My father wept with joy. My aunties said God had turned my mourning into dancing. I believed them. I truly did. I looked at Kelechi's face on our wedding day. That broad, steady face, the face of a man who had held me together when I was breaking apart. And I thought, finally, my story is turning good. I did not know that the same man standing beside me at that altar had a secret sitting inside his chest like a stone he had swallowed and could never cough back up. The wedding itself was the kind our town would talk about for years. Kelechi's family owned 3 houses and a fleet of trucks that moved goods from the north down to the coast. There was a live band, there was a cow slaughtered whole, and there was enough jollof rice to feed the next 3 villages. I wore white lace that cost more than my father earned in a year. And when Kelechi placed the ring on my finger, the entire compound erupted into song. But even in the middle of all that joy, I noticed something. I noticed Tubena. Tubena was Kelechi's best friend, the one who stood beside him at the altar as his best man. On paper, that was normal. Every groom needs a best man. But something about the way Tubena looked at me that day unsettled me. It was not lust. I want to be very clear about that, because you might assume that that's where this story is going. It was not desire in his eyes. It was fear. Every time our gazes crossed during the ceremony, Tobena would look away first and his jaw would tighten like he was chewing on words he was forbidden to see. I told myself it was nothing. Groom's friends are often strange on wedding days. Some grieve the friendship changing shape, some drink too much palm wine too early, some simply do not know how to smile for photographs. I pushed the thought away and let the celebration carry me. By the time night fell, the compound was still loud with drumming outside, but inside our new bedroom it was quiet. Kelechi undressed slowly, tiredly, the way a man does after carrying the weight of hosting 300 guests. He kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and within minutes, exhaustion pulled him under. My husband, a word I was still testing on my tongue like a new fruit, was asleep before midnight on our own wedding night. I lay there beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the drumming outside fade into laughter and then into silence. And that is when I heard the knock. Soft, careful. Not the knock of a drunk relative looking for more food. This was a knock that knew exactly what it was interrupting. I slipped out of bed, wrapped my wrapper around me, and opened the door. Tobena stood there in the dark, and I will never forget his face as long as I live. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether jumping was worse than staying. Ngozi, he whispered, I need to talk to you, now, before it's too late. I told him he was drunk, that whatever he wanted to say could wait until morning. He grabbed my wrist, not roughly, but firmly, the grip of a man who had run out of time to be gentle. It cannot wait, he said. If I don't tell you tonight, I will never find the courage again, and you will spend the rest of your life sleeping beside a man who let another man die for him. Those were not the exact 11 words I promised you at the beginning of this story. Those come later, and when you hear them, you will understand why they nearly stopped my heart. But that sentence alone was enough to pull me out into the cold night air in nothing but my wrapper. My wedding henna still fresh on my hands, my new husband snoring peacefully in the room behind me, while his best friend prepared to burn our marriage to the ground before it had even begun. We walked to the far edge of the compound, near the cassava garden where the drumming outside could not reach us. Tobene's hands were shaking. I remember thinking, this man is more afraid than I am. And somehow that frightened me even more. Say it, I told him. Whatever it is, say it plainly. Don't make me guess. He looked at the ground for a long moment. Then he lifted his eyes to mine and said the words that split my wedding night in two. Chibueke did not sleep. Kelechi was there that night, and Kelechi has never told you the truth about what happened at that river. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I had to sit with it, standing barefoot in wet grass at 1 a.m, still smelling of my own wedding perfume. My husband, a word I was still testing on my tongue like a new fruit, was asleep in the very bed I had left minutes earlier, while his best friend prepared to burn our marriage to the ground
before it had even begun. I did not scream, I want you to know that, because everyone assumes a woman screams in a moment like that. I did not scream. I went cold. Completely. Terrifyingly cold. The way water goes still right before it freezes. Explain, I said. My voice did not shake. I don't know where that steadiness came from, but I am grateful for it even now, because it was that steadiness that let me survive the next several days. Tobena told me that on the night Chibueke died, the three of them, Kelechi, Tobena, and Chibueke, had gone down to the river together. It was not unusual. The men often met there to drink and talk before big life events, and Chibueke's introductory ceremony was only 3 weeks away. But that night on the river, with palm wine loosening tongues, Kelechi finally said it out loud. He told Chibueke he had always wanted me. Chibueke laughed it off at first, the way friends do. But Kelechi pressed harder, and the laughter turned to something sharper.
Tobena said there was a struggle. Not a planned attack. He was firm about that, almost desperate for me to believe it. But he shoved in anger near the slippery rocks at the river's edge. Chibueke fell. He hit his head, and by the time the two of them pulled him from the water, it was already too late. We panicked, Tobena said, his voice cracking. Kelechi begged me not to say anything. He said if the truth came out, his family's name would be destroyed, and mine too, because I was there, and said nothing to stop it. We agreed to call it an accident. We told the elders we found him already in the water. Ngozi, I have carried this for 2 years. I watched you grieve a man I helped erase the truth about. I watched you slowly fall for the very person responsible, and I told myself I would stay silent forever. But tonight, watching you become his wife, I could not let you build your whole life on a lie I helped bury. I stood there in silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute. My mind was doing something strange. It was not fully believing him, and yet it was not fully doubting him either. Something in his voice carried the unmistakable weight of guilt that had been rotting a man from the inside for 2 years. But something else nagged at me too. A small itch at the back of my mind that I could not yet name. Why now? Why tonight of all nights after 2 full years of silence? A man who buried a secret that deep does not simply decide to dig it up on his best friend's wedding night out of pure conscience. Something else was driving him. I did not sleep that night. I returned to the bedroom, lay stiffly beside the man I had just married, and stared at the ceiling until the compound roosters began to crow. Kelechi never stirred. He slept the sleep of a man with nothing on his conscience, or perhaps the sleep of a man who had made peace with what he'd done so long ago that it no longer disturbed his rest. Both possibilities terrified me equally. The following morning, I watched Kelechi differently. I watched the way he greeted his mother, Madam Uju, with that same practiced smile. I watched the way his eyes lingered a moment too long on Tobena during breakfast, as though measuring him, weighing something unspoken between them. And I watched Madam Uju herself, Kelechi's mother, watching me. Not with the warmth of a new mother-in-law admiring her son's bride, but with the sharp assessing gaze of a woman guarding something precious, something she had fought hard to protect. I decided that morning that I would not confront Kelechi directly. Not yet. If Tobena's story was true, a direct confrontation would only give Kelechi time to prepare a defense, to smooth the lie into something more convincing. I needed proof. I needed to understand why Tobena had chosen that specific night to break 2 years of silence. And so I began, quietly, carefully, to become a detective inside my own marriage, smiling at breakfast, laughing at the right moments, while underneath I was unraveling every thread I could find. The first thread came from Chibueke's younger sister, a girl named Chiamaka, who still lived 2 streets from my father's house. I visited her under the pretense of simply missing her brother, of wanting to talk to someone who remembered him the way I did. She welcomed me warmly, made me tea, and within minutes she said something that stopped my breath in my chest. "You know," she said, staring into her cup, "I never told anyone this because who would believe a grieving girl talking nonsense? But the week before my brother died, a woman came to our house. She did not give her name.
She spoke to my mother alone behind closed doors, and afterwards my mother cried for 3 days straight and refused to say why. Then Chibuike died and I forgot about it because grief swallows everything else. But sometimes I wonder if that visit and his death were connected.
I asked her to describe the woman. Jamaka closed her eyes, trying to remember. Tall, she said. Well-dressed. She wore a raka with a gold pattern I had never seen before, the kind only rich families can afford. She came in a car, not on foot like the rest of us. A tall, wealthy woman, arriving in a private car, speaking privately with Chibuke's mother a week before his death, and reducing her to 3 days of silent tears. I did not need to ask twice who that might have been. There was only one woman in our entire town who fit that description and had a reason to fear a marriage between Chibuke and me, Madam Uju, Kelechi's mother. This is where the story stopped being simple, because if Madam Uju had visited Chibuke's mother before his death, then the accident by the river was not simply a drunken argument gone wrong between 2 young men. There was an older hand moving pieces on this board, and Tobena's confession, as devastating as it was, might only have been telling me half of the truth, or perhaps a version of the truth that had been carefully shaped to protect someone even more powerful than himself. Before I go further into what I found next, let me pause here, because this is the part of the story where everything I believed started cracking apart piece by piece, and I need you to stay with me, because the next revelation changes absolutely everything. If a story like this is keeping you gripped, tap that subscribe button now, because trust me, you do not want to miss where this goes. I decided to speak to Chibuke's mother myself. She was an old woman now, frail, her hands trembling with the tremor that grief and age often bring together. When I mentioned the woman in the gold-patterned wrapper, her whole body stiffened, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. I thought she might ask me to leave. Instead, she reached for my hand and held it the way she used to when I was still her son's intended bride. "My daughter," she said quietly, "some truths are heavier than the people who carry them." I kept this silent because I was afraid of what that family could do to mine if I spoke. They own everything in this town, the market stalls, the transport union, even the borehole water half of us drink from. A poor widow does not fight people like that and survive. She told me that Madam Uju had come to her that week not to threaten her directly, but to offer her money, a large sum, more than her husband had earned in his entire life, if she would quietly convince Chibuke to end things with me and instead accept a marriage arrangement with a distant cousin from another town. When Chibuke's mother refused, insisting her son would choose his own wife, Madam Uju's warmth turned cold in an instant. She said, before leaving, "Some rivers run faster than we expect. Be careful what stubbornness costs you." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. That was not a vague warning. That was, in hindsight, something far closer to a threat, spoken by a woman who, days later, would become my mother-in-law and whose son had, by his own best friend's confession, been present at the river where Chibuke drowned. Now, here is where the story takes its sharpest turn, the one I promise you did not see coming, because I certainly did not. I went back to Tobena, this time not asking gently, but demanding answers, armed with what I now knew. I told him about the woman in the gold wrapper, about the threat delivered to Chibuke's mother days before the drowning. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, and what I saw was not surprise. It was dread. The dread of a man who realized the version of events he had chosen to share was about to be pulled apart, exposing something underneath that he had hoped would never surface.
"You already knew," I said slowly. "You knew about Madam Oju's visit. That's not something you left out by accident." Tobena finally broke. He confessed that the story he told me on our wedding night, the drunken argument, the accidental shove, was not entirely false, but it was not entirely true either. It was the story Kelechi's mother had constructed for the two young men to tell the night Chibuke died, and had drilled it into them until it became easier to believe than to question. The truth, Tobena admitted with tears now streaming freely down his face, was far darker. Madam Uju had never trusted Chibuke. Years before any of this, her late husband, Kelechi's father, had owed money to Chibuke's grandfather, an old debt tied to land that Madam Uju's family desperately wanted back, land that would only return to them if their bloodline remained unbroken by outside marriage into that family. It was an old tangled inheritance dispute that most young people in town had forgotten, but Madam Uju had not. She feared that if Chibuke married me, and if any future dispute over that land resurfaced, my marriage would tie our two families together in a way that could threaten her claim entirely. She wanted Chibuke gone from my life one way or another, and when persuasion and bribery failed with his mother, she turned to something far more dangerous. Madam Uju had sent a man, not Kelechi, not directly, to the riverside that night to frighten Chibuke, to scare him into breaking things off quietly with me, to make it look like a warning gone wrong if things escalated. Kelechi and Tobena had gone to the river that night unaware of what was coming. When the hired man confronted Chibuke, a struggle broke out. Kelechi tried to intervene, tried to protect his friend, but arrived only in time to see Chibuke fall against the rocks and slip beneath the water. The hired man fled into the darkness before either of them could see his face clearly. Terrified and already suspecting his own mother's hand in what had happened, Kelechi made the devastating choice to protect her rather than expose her. He and Tobena agreed to say nothing about a third man at the river, fearing that any investigation would eventually trace back to Madam Uju and destroy their entire family. A family Kelechi depended on for his inheritance, his business, his very future. He chose silence. He chose his mother and his fortune over justice for his best friend. And then, in the cruelest twist fate could arrange, Kelechi fell in love with the woman his silence had widowed before she ever became a bride. Whether that love was genuine or, as I now had to consider, simply another way of keeping me and the truth close and controlled, I could not yet see. I confronted Kelechi 3 days after our wedding. I did not scream, did not throw accusations wildly. I simply sat across from him at our dining table and told him everything Tobena and Chibuke's mother had revealed. I watched color drained from his face piece by piece. Watched a man who had built 2 years of careful composure collapse in front of me. He did not deny it. That, more than anything, told me it was true. He wept. Real tears, I believe, though grief and guilt can sometimes wear the same face as love. He told me he wanted to confess 100 times, that guilt had eaten him hollow every single night we spent together, but that cowardice always won. He said he loved me, truly, and that loving me had made the silence unbearable, yet somehow also impossible to break, because breaking it meant losing me and destroying his mother in the same breath. I am not asking you to forgive me, he said, his voice breaking. I am only asking you to let me make it right, however that looks. I did not answer him that night. Instead, I did something none of them expected. I went, quietly, with Chiamaka and Chibuke's mother beside me for courage, to report everything to the town's council of elders, the same council that had closed Chibuke's case as an accident 2 years earlier. I brought Tobena with me too, because by then his guilt had transformed into something closer to resolve. He stood before the elders and repeated everything he had told me, including the existence of the hired man Madam Uju had sent, a detail he admitted he had hidden even from Kelechi for years, only recently piecing it together himself after quietly tracking down the man's identity through a cousin who worked at the transport union Madam Uju controlled. That was the final twist, the one that turned the entire town upside down. The hired man was found, a laborer named Ifeanyi,
who had once worked on Madam Oju's farm and had fled town shortly after Chibuoke's death, resurfacing years later in a neighboring state under a different name. Under questioning by the elders and faced with witnesses who could place him near the river that night, Ifeanyi finally confessed. He admitted Madam Oju had paid him to frighten Chibuoke, to make the young man call off the wedding through intimidation. He swore he never intended for anyone to die, that the confrontation had spiraled beyond his control, and that he had fled out of pure terror rather than malice. Madam Oju denied everything at first, standing before the council with the same regal defiance she had worn my entire courtship with her son. But when confronted with Chibuoke's mother's testimony about the threat delivered years earlier, and Ifeanyi's confession, and the trembling admission from her own son that he had suspected her involvement all along and chosen silence to protect her, her composure finally shattered. She confessed to sending Ifeanyi, though she insisted, weeping now herself, that she had only meant to scare Chibuoke away, never to see him harmed. Intent, the elders reminded her sharply, does not undo consequence. A young man was dead. A family had grieved for 2 years believing a lie, and an entire community had trusted a story built entirely on the silence of the guilty. The council's judgment was swift by our town standards. Madam Oju was stripped of her position on the Market Women's Council. Her assets tied to the land dispute was seized and returned to Chibuoke's family for restitution, and she was publicly disgraced before the entire town square, a humiliation in our culture often heavier than any prison sentence. Ifeanyi faced formal charges with the state authorities since his actions had directly led to a death, regardless of intent. And Kelechi, though he had not orchestrated the death himself, was made to publicly confess his 2 years of silence, a confession that cost him nearly every ounce of respect his family name had once commanded in that town. Now, you might expect me to tell you I left him immediately, that I packed my belongings that same week and never looked back. Real life and real grief are rarely that clean. I did leave for a time. I moved back into my father's house for nearly 4 months, unable to look at Kelechi without seeing the riverbank, without hearing Tobena's trembling voice in the dark repeating those 11 devastating words that started this entire unraveling. Kelechi was there that night, and he has never told you the truth. I grieved Chibuoke all over again, this time with the added weight of knowing his death had not been an accident at all, but the collateral damage of greed dressed up as inheritance and pride. During those 4 months, Kelechi did not chase me the way desperate men sometimes do, flooding a woman with gifts and grand gestures to buy back her trust. Instead, he did something that surprised me. He funded, quietly and without seeking public credit, the completion of the house that Chibuoke had been building with his own 2 hands before he died. The house he had promised me we would live in together. Kelechi hired the same laborers Chibuoke had once worked alongside, followed the same blueprint Chibuoke had sketched out on scraps of paper his mother still kept in a tin box, and when it was finished, he handed the keys not to me, but to Chibuoke's mother, telling her the house belonged to her family, a small, insufficient attempt at repayment for silence he could never fully undo. It was that act, more than any apology, that made me willing to sit across from him again months later. Not because it erased what he had done, but because it told me something true about the difference between a man who hides from his guilt forever and a man who eventually chooses to carry its weight into the light, however late that choice arrives. We are still married today, Kelechi and I, though our marriage looks nothing like the fairy tale that entire town celebrated on our wedding day. It is quieter now, more honest, built on the uncomfortable understanding that love and betrayal can, in the strangest and most painful ways, come wrapped in the very same hands. Tobena, for his part, eventually left our town altogether, unable to live any longer in the shadow of what silence had cost him. Before he left, he came to see me one last time, and he said something I have carried with me ever since.
I told you the truth that night, not because I am a good man, but because I could no longer live as a coward. Sometimes the bravest thing a guilty man can do is simply stop protecting the lie that is destroying someone else. I think about those words often, especially on nights when sleep refuses to come easily, because if there is one thing this entire ordeal taught me, it is this. The truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, no matter how many powerful hands try to keep it underground, always finds a crack to climb through eventually. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in a whispered confession at midnight, on the very night you thought your greatest joy had finally begun. And when it does, the only real choice you have is whether you will have the courage to follow it all the way to the bottom of the river, no matter how much it costs you to see what's really there. If this story moved you, touched something in you, or kept you holding your breath the way it deserved to, do not scroll past without hitting that subscribe button, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about the secrets families bury, the silence that protects the wrong people, and the women brave enough to dig until they find the truth, no matter how much it devastates them along the way. Subscribe now, turn on your notifications, and I will see you in the next story.